With the report published, one thing's already clear. Far from providing closure, it heralds a new phase in the partisan battle between President Trump and his Democrat critics. They believe Robert Mueller, the special counsel, needs to testify to Congress, and quickly.
I have formally requested that the special counsel Mueller testify before the House Judiciary Committee as soon as possible so we can get some answers to these critical questions.
The White House argues senior Democrats are just rather embarrassed that the report found no evidence that the president had colluded with Russia to get elected. Democrats argue testimony is needed, not least because the Attorney General spun Mueller's findings.
For Barr to all of a sudden say, well, the president's innocent, he's got no business doing that, and it's an outrage for him to do that. And so having Mueller there to explain why he couldn't exonerate him might help the American people to understand the seriousness and the gravity and the outrage of President Trump's conduct.
And Mr. Barr was asked today about whether President Trump had really got the clean bill of health he claimed from Robert Mueller.
He made it clear that he had not made the determination that there was a crime.
But of course, for Trump opponents, as collusion has fallen away as a possible grounds for impeachment, the question of possible obstruction of justice has assumed centre stage. Democrat-controlled committees in the House of Representatives plan to push forward with their own investigations.
Tampering with witnesses, trying to influence their testimony, trying to stop an investigation. I mean, these are very serious acts, and they're an abuse of power.
Ultimately, though, the question of whether the House impeaches is a political judgment, balancing the low chance of success, given Republican control of the Senate, against the politics of pushing on.
There will be no impeachment, and this report, although it will encourage some extreme Democrats to look for the possibility of impeachment, in the end, wiser and older heads will prevail. The Democrats will realize that it would be a political mistake to impeach based on this evidence, as it was a mistake for the Republicans to impeach President Clinton. And in the end, the election of 2020 will decide what the American people think.
Tonight, signs that the Democrat leadership may indeed lack the stomach for impeachment, but they'll certainly use the report's contents for political effect as election primaries loom.
Mark Urban now to talk about whether the long-awaited Mueller report was a bombshell or a damp squib. I'm joined in the studio by former US Deputy Homeland Security Advisor to President Obama, Amy Pope, and from Washington by Republican strategist and former Trump official Lauren Claffey, and former Chief of the Watergate Task Force, Richard Ben-Veniste. Good evening to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. First of all, Richard, did Mueller do the best he could have done, do you think?
Well, this is hardly a ringing endorsement for President Trump. We can all be relieved that there was no finding that he committed treason in assisting the Russians in corrupting the 2016 election. However, as far as obstruction of justice is concerned, there were 10 instances in this very substantial report that are laid out in chapter and verse for further inquiry. He left it to the Congress, as actually we did in Watergate, when we found evidence that President Nixon had conspired with others to obstruct the Watergate investigation and sent that evidence to the House of Representatives in a report that was called at the time the pathway to potential impeachment. And here, Mr. Mueller has done the same. He has provided evidence for further inquiry to show that President Trump did not succeed, perhaps out of incompetence rather than corrupt will, for example, in the firing attempt of Mr. Mueller through his counsel, Mr. McGahn.
And of course, you know, exactly the same thing happened, of course, with Nixon when he tried to get other people to do his bidding to fire his special prosecutor as well. Do you think then that
But the special prosecutor was fired.
Exactly.
Archibald Cox was fired, and Mr. McGahn may have saved President Trump's bacon by refusing to follow his instruction to have Mueller fired.
Right. Let me bring in Amy Pope here. I mean, what do you think the Democrats should do now? You know, we're what, 18 months off from the 2020 election. Do they really, you know, Nancy Pelosi wants to see Mueller in front of that Justice Committee as quickly as possible. But is it really the time to go for impeachment? Is this what the public wants?
It's a real question, but there are very serious allegations that are contained in this report. And the special prosecutor essentially says, look, my hands are tied because of the Department of Justice rules against prosecuting or indicting a sitting president. But Congress, you have the constitutional authority and the obligation to make sure that these charges are seen through. So I think Nancy Pelosi is going to be weighing making sure that she doesn't alienate the public against exercising her constitutional obligations.
Yeah, and to be seen to be exercising constitutional obligations, knowing all the while that she doesn't take the Senate.
That's right. I mean, inevitably, it is going to be very difficult. Well, you'll get impeachment because that's the House's role, but that doesn't mean he'll be convicted in the Senate, right? And so she has to make a calculation that it is worth laying out the charges to the American public. So ultimately, what will happen is that the voters will make a decision in 2020.
Laura, from your point of view, you know, what do you think Trump should do next? I mean, you know, you're a strategist. What should he do?
Yeah, I think he needs to move on from this as quickly as possible. I mean, in this instance, I do think that Amy was correct in to say that they probably won't bring impeachment charges against him because it's been so politically unpopular before, we saw with Clinton. But they are going to be using this pretty aggressively during the 2020 campaign. We're already in the swing of things. Big campaign season ahead of us. So I do think that Trump needs to move on. He needs to talk about other things beyond this. And honestly, he shouldn't have been talking about it so much to begin with, because if there was no collusion, and he was not colluding with the Russians this entire time, he only hurt himself, I think, in speaking so much about this investigation and the damage that it was doing to him.
Do you think he took fright? I mean, it seems to be his extreme reaction to the idea of the special prosecutor in the first place, and then to, as you say, to create all this rumpus, to create all this sound and fury, but signifying something in this case, which appears to have been obstruction. You know, this firestorm was much of his own making.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, they're alluding or claiming obstruction for a crime that wasn't committed, right? And so if he hadn't been so defensive in the beginning, he may not be in the situation that he's in right now.
Ben, what do you think of that? Do you think he can put it past him so quickly? Do you think Nancy Pelosi's got a very, very tight judgment to make on whether to go for impeachment or not? Should she go for impeachment? Richard, sorry.
You're asking me a political question. I think the inclination is not to, but there are other remedies. There could be something short of impeachment voted out. But the facts should not be left uninformed. We still have a report here that shows that a significant amount of evidence to suggest that there was a corrupt intent to terminate, to truncate, to obstruct the investigation of Mr. Mueller. Why did he do that? What was Trump hiding? I think most Americans will apply that common sense matrix to the evidence here if they take the time to read it. And I suspect the Republicans will be very happy to hide it under the rug.
I mean, Amy, you know, if you're working a steel mill and bringing home a wage that you weren't bringing home last year, if you have got a new job, if you are feeling some of the benefits of whether it is a transient economic boom, you don't care about this. I mean, we've learned about this about Clinton, haven't we?
I think that's fair, but what we do know is that a significant amount of people, a percentage of the population here, does care.
Is it about the moral authority of the commander-in-chief?
It's the dignity of the office.
Yeah.
It's the moral authority. It is the fact that he's the president of the country, and there are a series of connections between him, his campaign, and a known adversary of the United States. This is the man who is meant to protect the national security of the United States, who seems to be putting his personal interest before the country's.
Well, you say, Lauren, that he should move on from this, but obviously, the Democrats are going to make sure that he doesn't. Is there any way that he can, as it were, atone for this?
I think the Democrats are not going to move on from this on a congressional level. I think they'll have investigation after investigation. But on the campaign trail, I don't think that they're going to be pounding this as hard as perhaps Amy is indicating. We've already seen that this investigation has been going on a while, and the polling shows that people have made up their mind either way. If you're a Republican and you support Trump, you believe that it's a witch hunt and there was no collusion and there's nothing to see here. If you're a Democrat, you believe that he is unfit to be president, he is guilty, obstruction of justice, collusion, whatever it is, he is guilty. And those people are not moving from those positions. But what they do want to talk to the candidates about is those kitchen table issues that affect them every single day. Immigration, healthcare, education. And so they're not going to be tolerating much of this conversation from their potential candidate.
Thank you all very much indeed.